Okay, so today we're gonna be talking about eyeshadow primer and why you use it. I receive a lot of questions from a lot of different people about eyeshadow primer, if you need to use it, why it's necessary, which ones are best, if you can use a concealer, if you should be setting your primer, if you should be setting your concealer with translucent powder, with eyeshadow. There's a lot, so we're gonna get into all of that. Quickly, I just wanted to say, quarantine, I had to take off the claws, so I don't wanna talk about it. So I'm gonna start off with showing you the difference between eyeshadow with primer and without. So if you are someone who is like, why is my eyeshadow not lasting? I don't understand, why doesn't it look good? Why can't I blend? And you're not using concealer, primer, anything, this could be the problem. So the primer that I'm gonna be showing you is the one by Anastasia Beverly Hills. This is a little bit of a controversial product because it only comes in one shade, which is quite light. It works for my skin tone, so I'm going to be using that. I'm gonna show you I'm gonna go through a bunch of other ones, so just whatever. So first up is amount. You don't need a lot, you really don't. This primer is tinted, this very light shade, and I believe the point of this primer was to make your eyeshadows very vibrant when you used it. So the lighter the color that you use, the more vibrant your eyeshadows are going to be. Obviously, if you are like medium to deep skin tone, this is going to guarantee that all of your eyeshadows are like super bright. So it's probably not ideal if you're going for something that's going to be a little bit more subdued. Anyway, this amount that I just showed you is pretty decent. Let's start putting it down. It might be a little too much, actually. Yeah, it might be a little bit too much. So you can see it is obviously much lighter than my skin tone. So what I like to do when I'm patting it out is, depending on how much I apply, it's always best, like this is too much. The amount that you apply, it's always best to start off with a little bit and then go in and build it up from there. So I definitely just put down too much. But what I'm gonna do is lightly pat and cover this whole area. And then I'm gonna wipe off my finger so that I don't have any more product on there, and then continue to pat. So if you're using this product, you're gonna feel that like as you're patting it out, it starts to set, it starts to kind of like mattify a little bit, but you can also feel like a little bit of a grip, if that makes sense. It's still got a little bit of stick to it, which is why eyeshadow primers are so different from using concealer, because they're meant to be able to hold the product while being able to blend it as well. So if I kind of run my finger over it, I feel like a little bit of a grip. But once we let that set, it actually creates like kind of a velvety layer on our skin. So it's going to be much easier to blend eyeshadow. So anyway, obviously the tinted ones are meant to get rid of any pigment. You can see the veins and pigment on this eye. Another great thing about, see now that I'm touching it, it's actually mattifying even more. You wanna make sure that you're blending it out a lot though. You do not want this area to be wet at all. Now with an eyeshadow primer, typically you do not need to set it. You can if you feel like you need a little bit of help blending. It also depends on the, like, I was gonna say the formula, the skin on your eyelid, whether it's oily, whether it's dry. There's a lot of factors. And I do have this crease right here. So typically like any kind of product will build up there eventually. So no matter how much I blend this out, I always try to make sure that I'm blending it out right before going in and placing my eyeshadow down. But the more I touch this, the more you wait, it's going to feel less like, a little less sticky, a little bit less wet. It's gonna set a little bit more. All right, so I'm gonna be using the Dominique Cosmetics Latte 2 palette. I'm gonna go in with this color right here. This is Strawberry Milk, and I'm gonna apply it to both sides. Okay, so I'm loading up my brush and then I'm tapping it off, and then I'm going to just start tapping it in my crease. And then once I have that product down, I'm gonna start blending. Okay, so that's my first pass. Decent blend, held onto the product. I'm gonna pick up a little bit more and kind of build it up in the crease. And then blend up to my eyebrow. Now I'm gonna do the same thing on the other side. Okay, so you can see, obviously you can see like all of my veins coming through. You can also see that like the color isn't quite as vibrant in this area. It has mixed a little bit with my skin tone and it's looking less true to the color and a little bit more warm, a little bit more salmony. It's also kind of patchy, like here, a little bit in here. Let's add another little bit. I am tapping my brush off for this side as well. So it's going on a little bit less like evenly. It's not really blending out as nicely as it was over here. It's a little bit more like evenly distributed. And it's kind of like sticking to certain areas. The blend itself isn't like terrible, but you can see how uneven the distribution is. Now, I tend to have like slightly more oily eyelids. They're not like so bad, but over time, the natural oils from my skin will just kind of like come through, and then I'll end up getting crazy creasing and transfer. So that is primer versus without. Pretty big difference. That looks so bad right there. Okay, why did I just take that off? I was gonna do concealer. That was stupid. Okay, I'm doing this again because I was gonna show you primer versus concealer, and for some reason I took this off, so it might look a little bit different. Another question that I get often is, can I use concealer? You can use concealer if it's the only thing that you have. The problem is using too much concealer. So one of the concealers that I suggest is a mattifying concealer because it's not going to stay too wet. If you are going to use a concealer, please don't use something like It Cosmetics by Under Eye. Way too thick, way too wet. It's not going to set correctly. I think some of you commented and said that is what you use. So again, if you have like ridiculously dry eyelids, then maybe it works for you. The one that I would suggest is Tarte, something like Tarte Shape Tape. The Makeup Revolution one is a little bit less pigmented, but it's like a similar formula. So anything that's like a little bit more mattifying. So this is in the shade Light Sand, and I'm gonna use a tiny amount, like that much to begin, just to squirt it everywhere. Patting it all over my lids. What's nice about this is, again, it's going to, cancel out the pigment on my eyelid. So I'm gonna use a tiny bit more. Again, it's always good to start off with a smaller amount. Now again, the nice thing about concealer is it cancels out any pigment that you have on your lid, and you're probably already using it to begin with, so it's probably like close to your skin tone or whatever. It means you don't have to go out and buy another product, so I understand that. If you are using a mattifying concealer or more matte formula, then there's a possibility, depending on your lid, that you can get a similar effect as the eyeshadow primer. So as I'm touching this, I do feel a little bit more stick than I did with my Anastasia primer. It's not really like setting like this. I don't really feel that velvety finish. It's a little bit more stick. So I'm going to show you how this blends without setting it. Again, always tapping off my brush, doing everything the same on all sides. Okay, first thing is first, I don't know if you can tell, when I put my brush down, it kind of holds on to the brush a little bit more. There's kind of like a little bit more pull on my lids. It's not really like smoothly moving over it. So I'm feeling a little bit more pull, which makes me want to hold my brush back a little bit further so that there's less like pressure in here. Because if you do that, then the bristles can kind of get like stuck against the skin. And that's when you get the like uneven distribution of the product. So I'm gonna hold it back a little bit and start blending out. And then I'm gonna try to build that up a little bit. All right, so again, if we're comparing these two sides, this is a lot better than nothing at all, obviously. It's a little bit better blend. The pigment isn't showing up as well as the primed side. It is blended a little bit better. It's a little bit less, I was gonna say pigmented, did I just say that? And it's slightly more patchy than this side. Like there are certain areas that are just kind of like holding onto the pigment more than others, but this is decent. However, again, because this is not something that is like meant for this, I think you can kind of tell, I don't know for sure. When I look in the mirror, this area looks quite like satin to matte. And then this area has like a little bit of shine to it. So again, similar to like if I wasn't using anything, my natural oils are gonna kind of like come through and sort of break down that concealer over time. So it's not gonna last as long. All right, now I wanna show you what happens when I use too much concealer. So I'm using that same Tarte Shape Tape, but I'm gonna apply a lot. Like when you look at those Instagram videos and they just like paint it on. This feels so wrong. All right, so that's obviously like way too much and like it feels very wet. So I am gonna give it a second to set a little bit if it does, and then I'm gonna blend it out. All right, let's pat that out. Now let's try to build up that shadow. Oh God. All right, again, do you see how much the brush is pulling the skin because the concealer is like grabbing onto those bristles? There's no like smooth blend at all. The bristles are just like being attached to that pigment and they can't like glide over the product. You can see all this pulling right here. Try to build it up and then blend it out. It's also, all of the pigment is just kind of like focused in that one area. It's not really blending. So the more I try to blend it, it's just kind of like moving this like blocky shape outward. Now, obviously building up the pigment a little bit more because it's much lighter, did make the pigment of the eyeshadow stand out a little bit more. Like it looks a little more true to color, but the blend is terrible. And you still have that like shiny look right here. So I know that I'm gonna get creasing. It's not gonna last. It's gonna end up kind of like breaking up throughout the day. All right, I'm just reapplying a small amount of concealer, similar to what I did on this side. And I'm going to show you how it blends when you set your concealer with a translucent powder. Personally, for me, the translucent powders that I like to use are something that are loose. I like the translucent powder by Kylie Cosmetics. This is my favorite one. Again, if you want like the pigment to be really intense, and you can use something a little bit lighter. This is light medium from LC Cosmetics, but it's quite, well, you guys can tell, but it's a lot lighter. So now I'm going to take a big fluffy brush. This is the Morphe M521 brush. Tiny bit of translucent powder. I'm gonna dip it into the powder and then tap off my brush so that I'm not going in with way too much. And then I'm gonna focus this in the crease because, like I said, my eyelids can get like a little bit oily throughout the day. So this is the area that I would need that. And then I'm gonna lightly just kind of blend it all over everything. Now, like I said, this is a good option if you don't want to have to buy a primer. If you already have a concealer, if you already have a translucent powder, you're sort of like repurposing products to, get the same results. But again, it's only going to work if you're using very tiny amounts. So I'm getting a similar feel when I go to blend this out that I do with the, I guess this is just concealer, that I do with the primer. It's maybe a little bit more matte, a little more smooth for the blending. So I feel a little bit less grip, which in my opinion, probably holding on to less of the pigment. So it's probably going to make it a little bit harder to build up the, oh wow, I'm so sick of saying pigment, the pigment of the eyeshadow. But if you're having a really hard time blending, going in with a tiny bit of translucent powder, particularly in the areas that are very difficult, like your crease, is probably going to help. So that blends really nicely. And I always suggest that if you are having a hard time blending, especially up in this area, to at least set the crease of your eye, because especially if you have like a crease in your eyelid like I do, it can be really hard to get in there without like, doing this kind of thing. And then when you do that, you sort of like manipulate where the eyeshadow is going. It's not gonna look the same when you drop that and you look straight ahead. So this is a really good option. And you can see how much better this blends when we set our lid with the translucent powder versus just the concealer. Now I'm going in again with that small amount of concealer on this side because I want to show you how the translucent powder compares to setting it with like a bone colored eyeshadow. Because that is something that I heard from like everybody when I first started doing makeup. It was everything, especially Jaclyn Hill. She used to always talk about that. Now this process has never made any sense to me. I don't understand why you would put down a super light eyeshadow because it's super pigmented. So what's the point? I don't get that. Like why an eyeshadow? Why not a translucent powder? It makes more sense to me to use something that's gonna be light that isn't going to overpower the actual eyeshadows that you're using, but we'll see. So I'm gonna use that same fluffy brush from Morphe, and I'm gonna be using the shade Frothy from the Dominique Cosmetics Latte 2 palette. I do have a code with Dominique Cosmetics just saying it's Alex, you get 10% off. So I'm gonna do the same thing that I did with the translucent powder. I'm gonna pick it up on the brush and then tap it off so I'm not going in with way too much. Make sure that this is patted out. And again, I'm gonna set the crease first and then kind of like blend it out. All right, so that's obviously a lot lighter than my skin tone. You can use anything that's like close to your skin tone. A lot of the time I see people use bone colors because they want the colors to be a little bit more vibrant. Yeah, so let's show how this blends. All right, so it does create like a more matte finish, similar to the translucent powder, but I think maybe you can see that because the eyeshadow has, or the eyeshadow that we set with has pigment already and it's a much lighter pigment, they're kind of mixing together and creating like a very, very light shade. So I'm actually kind of changed my tune a little bit on this. If you're using not too much, like if you're using a small amount of the concealer and then a small amount of the bone colored eyeshadow, it might actually help you do a little bit of blending because it's kind of creating a lighter shade than what you're putting down. So it's kind of creating like a middle step between the priming color and your skin color and then the eyeshadow color that you're going in with, which might actually help blending if you're having a problem with like the jumps between the values in those shades. It actually is blending like pretty nice. The only thing that I do notice is that it a little bit, because of the lighter pigment, it is a little bit harder to build up the pigment of the shadow. So, like I said before, it depends on like if you're trying to lighten the color that you're going in with. If you are, then this actually works pretty well. Yeah, I don't mind it actually. I've changed my opinion about this a little bit. However, it has to be done correctly. Like if you're going in with that thick ass amount of concealer and a shitload of this, actually I'll show you that next. It's not gonna go well. Let's do that on the other side. Oh yeah, I forgot. So I'm gonna go in with a shit ton of concealer, like all of those videos. So just a fuckload of concealer, which this probably isn't even as much as they usually use. And then I think I'm gonna switch up the brush because we're gonna use a lot. So I'm gonna go in with the Sigma E25 blending brush, which gets a little bit thinner as you turn it. So I'm gonna pack on this eyeshadow all over this concealer, and then let's see how that blends. It already just looks like a lot of product. Can you see how like dry and crepey my eyelid looks? I'm not a fan of that. Okay, so picking up that same shade, tapping it off. Ooh, look it. Do you see that? So it is, I mean, it's not blending perfectly. It is gliding over the shadow, not horribly. However, do you see how dry this looks right here? All right, so this right here is with that thick ass concealer and powder. So also keep in mind, like if your eye, just the skin around your eyes in general is incredibly delicate. And if you have dry eyelids and you're placing down all of this concealer and then all of this powder and then all of this eyeshadow on top of that, it's just gonna dry out your skin even more. So if you feel like you're doing these steps and you're like, why, I don't understand why my eyelids are so dry or irritated or crepey, then that might be the reason. I'm just gonna leave this shit on right now. All right guys, so a couple suggestions that I would make for eyeshadow primers are obviously the Anastasia one if it works for your skin tone or if you want your eyeshadow to be super vibrant. I love that one. Like I said, it's got a nice grip, it's nice and velvety. This is the one that I've been using for a while now. Another one that I really like is this one by Japanesque. This is the Velvet Touch eyeshadow primer. I think it's a little more sheer. It is, and it's a slightly more of a nude shade. Yeah, it's much more sheer actually. So as I blend it out, it's got way less pigment and it becomes a little bit more, oh, it doesn't have the best smell. It becomes maybe even a little bit more velvety than the Anastasia one. But yeah, it really sheers out. So if you don't need a lot of pigment covering, then that is a nice one. But another one, drugstore, is the e.l.f. Cosmetics, what the fuck is it called? I don't know, but it's their eyeshadow primer. I used the shade Translucent. I don't have it here now, but it didn't have any extra pigment and it was great drugstore. Like it didn't really, it was like maybe tiny bit of a blurring of the pigment on your eyes, like maybe lightened it a little bit. It was mostly sheer, but beautiful formula, like held onto the pigment really well, super velvety and blendable. I've never used MAC Paint Pot. I know that's big amongst makeup artists, like professional makeup artists. If there's a primer that you think I need to try that is the best, I have used one by Urban Decay, not the biggest fan of that one. Let me know. Again, concealers, go for something that's gonna be a little bit more matte, but you can adjust for your skin type on your lids. Yeah. That's pretty much it. I hope that this was helpful and educational, informational, all the above. And let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, primers that you would suggest, videos that you want to see next, all that shit. Make sure you subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. See, told you I'd do it in every single video.